bringing you the latest in tax credit news, insight, and analysis. This is Tax Credit Tuesday with your host, Michael Novogradac.
Hello, I'm Michael Novogradac, and this is Tax Credit Tuesday. This is the January 28th, 2025 episode. As our viewers on YouTube can see, my guests this week are Rich Larsen and Peter Lawrence. Rich, as our frequent listeners and viewers know, is a partner in Novogradac's Toms River, New Jersey office. And Peter Lawrence is Novogradac's Director of Public Policy and Government Relations. And those that listened to last week's episode know that Peter is on for the second straight week. Now, Rich is one of Novogradac's Public Housing and U.S. Department of Urban Development, or HUD, experts. And Peter, of course, is our expert on Capitol Hill. There's been lots of chatter inside and outside the Beltway in recent days, really in recent months, about the future of HUD and HUD funding. Obviously, that's a direct response to a change in administration. A new administration in Congress always will lead to some level of changes at HUD. But that's also due to the chatter on the campaign trail from many, including Vice President J.D. Vance, Elon Musk, who's the chair of the proposed Department of Government Efficiency Advisory Commission. The chatter on the campaign trail from both of them and others about cuts, major cuts in federal government, which on a derivative basis means everyone who works with HUD is concerned about what cuts could be coming to HUD. Now, as a reminder, thinking about cuts coming to HUD, we can look a bit into the future by going back and looking at Trump's first administration. And I would note, among a lot of other changes and proposals and the rest, former HUD Secretary Ben Carson did propose cuts to the Community Development Block Grant Program, as well as the Home Grant Program and the Public Housing Capital Fund. Now, in this podcast, Rich, Peter, and I are going to discuss what some of this chatter might mean for public housing authorities across the country. First, we're going to look at the status of HUD with the new administration, give some brief thoughts there. But then we're going to focus on the potential upsides or really possibilities or really opportunities that will come as a result of this new administration. When you think of the SWOT analysis, we're going to skip the strengths and weaknesses and focus on opportunities and threats. So after we talk about opportunities, we'll then focus on some of the potential threats or challenges that could lie ahead. And then we'll conclude with both Peter and Rich sharing with our viewers, our audience, what they're telling their clients and the various advocates that they work with about some of these opportunities and possible threats. As you can tell, that's a lot to discuss today. So if you're ready, let's get started. Rich and Peter, welcome back to Tax Credit Tuesday. Well, Happy New Year, Rich. And thanks for coming back from last week, Peter.
Always a pleasure, Mike.
Before we start, I'll have you say a few words about what services you provide to Novogradac clients. And then once Rich finishes, Peter, please jump in and share a little bit more about what services you provide to Novogradac clients.
Well, thank you, Mike. It is great to be here with you again. For those of you that don't know, I am the lead partner in Novogradac's PHA auditing practice, public housing authorities. We audit approximately 80 PHAs across the United States and the Virgin Islands. We also provide various consulting services with regard to various programs, including the Rental Assistance Demonstration Program, the Moving to Work Program, and we also will provide general transactional guidance with submitting financial statements to HUD's Real Estate Assessment Center, or REAC, as they're repeated.
Thanks, Rich. Please jump in, Peter.
So I'm the Director of Public Policy and Government Relations for Novogradac, and in that role, I help coordinate the firm's practice with interaction with the federal government, both executive branch agencies like HUD and Treasury, and also Congress and key committees that oversee the HUD and Treasury, like the tax running committees and the banking committees. So in that role, I also am available if you have problems with HUD regulations, programs, need guidance of some sort. I'm very open to engaging with you to help work on those regulations and guidance to make the programs work better.
And in some ways, Peter, your work with the Department of Housing and Urban Development is a bit of you going back to your original roots.
Indeed, I
Is that
got my
correct?
start here in Washington, D.C. in housing policy, working for HUD in the Office of Policy Development Research as a presidential management fellow. But that was a while ago, Mike.
Yeah, my while ago's are a little bit farther ago than your while
Yes.
ago's. So I know while ago's. So in terms of talking about HUD, I felt like the natural place to start is at the top. And we all know that Scott Turner's been nominated to be the next Secretary of the Department of Housing and Urban Development. For many in the housing world, Scott Turner is a fresh name. We at Novogradac, of course, got to know Scott through his role with Opportunity Zones in the first Trump administration, and pretty excited that he was nominated. And we certainly look forward to working with Scott and his team at HUD. But if you could share a little bit more, Peter, with our audience as to Scott's background leading up to this nomination, please do that.
Sure, happy to do so, Mike. As you noted, he's got a long history with Opportunity Zones. He led the White House Opportunity and Revitalization Council during Trump's first term. Technically was a HUD employee at that time on detail to the White House. He currently is the chief visionary officer for JPI, a Dallas-based multifamily developer. So he's got experience in the housing development business, the multifamily side in particular, which is, I think, always helpful because not always you get someone, a HUD secretary, with that type of experience. He was in the Texas state legislature, so he's got state policy level experience as well. And again, just to reiterate, his housing policy is informed by his connection to Opportunity Zones, and he traveled with then HUD Secretary Dr. Ben Carson during the first Trump administration to talk about Opportunity Zones, why they're important, why they should be invested on. So we very much expect him to focus on Opportunity Zones and his likely tenure as secretary. And I do note that he has a vote in the Senate Banking Committee on his confirmation on Thursday, which we expect him to pass. And then sometime after that, the full Senate will likely vote on his confirmation. And so we expect him to be leading HUD soon.
And then, Peter, we're recording this a week early. So that confirmation hearing before or after the podcast post?
Oh, yes. My apologies. Yes, it's this Thursday, January 23rd is the committee vote. And so when this podcast is posted, he may have already received his full Senate vote as well. And he may be confirmed by the time this podcast is recording.
Great. Thank you for that. Now, as I noted in the introduction, I want to talk about opportunities as well as threats or concerns that those outside of HUD have. And I like to be optimistic. So I'm going to lead with opportunities. And in terms of opportunities, Peter, maybe you can discuss it more at a public policy at a higher level, a more national level, in terms of some of the opportunities. And then, Rich, I'd like to turn to you after we have a discussion about that to talk a little bit more about what it means for an actual public housing authority.
Sure.
Please, Peter, share your overall thoughts on HUD under the new Trump administration.
Happy to do so. As we just discussed moments ago, we do believe that he's going to continue his experience in Opportunity Zones. We do expect Opportunity Zones to be potentially, considered extended, at least maybe made permanent by this Congress as part of their tax reconciliation legislation that will be developed over the course of the year. And we know that Scott Turner, as a great advocate, will try to bring back that type of focus for all HUD's programs. We also understand that deregulation is going to be a key theme to try to loosen the hand of the federal government on a variety of housing stakeholders, including public housing authorities. And there's also, and we saw this actually in an executive order that Trump just issued, talking about removing barriers to affordable housing development and reducing costs. And so that we definitely think that there's going to be efforts along those lines. Now, it's a very high principle. How that's translated to HUD programs is still yet to be seen, but I think there's some possible positive implications for a lot of housing stakeholders, including PHAs on that. In particular, and I know Rich will talk about this more, there's potential that they'll make the RAD program permanent. Right now, it's a demonstration program that expires in 2029, but we could see efforts to try to make it a permanent program and remove the existing 455,000 public housing unit cap. We definitely think that among all the various competitive HUD funding programs, that they will reinstate, the positive consideration for those investments going into opportunity zones. We'll see, I think, efforts to try to streamline and find efficiencies in HUD programs generally. And, again, deregulation is a key part of that potentially. One particular program, the moving to work program that Rich mentioned, that sort of was expanded under Trump's first term. We think that implementation will accelerate, and potentially they'll consider greater expansion of that. And then one thing we're also very much hopeful that Scott Turner will look at is providing relief under the Build America, Buy America regulation, which, for those who are not familiar with that requires federal financial assistance that is used to help finance quote unquote infrastructure projects be required to source materials and manufactured products here in America as opposed to from abroad. And that adds a considerable amount of costs to affordable housing development. And, we're hopeful that the new administration will take a second look at that and potentially, many people will say housing isn't necessarily infrastructure as envisioned. I think for the Build America, Buy America initiative, in any case, to what extent it is, there should be some more flexibility to help reduce the costs of developing housing with federal financial assistance, including HUD funding. And then lastly, I guess I'll just mention again, there's going to be an effort to focus on reducing regulatory barriers to affordable housing developments. I want to acknowledge that a lot of those barriers are on the state and local level, but I think there are some issues that are influenced by federal regulations like the National Environmental Policy Act and various other federal policies that I think, Scott Turner is going to try to help reduce and remove to the extent that he can. So I think I'll end there.
Okay. Thank you for that. I know in preparing for this podcast, being able to limit, there's so much we can talk about on that front. So I appreciate that high level overview. I particularly like your emphasis on regulatory barriers and the like, because I think that applies across all the community development incentives that we work. Every area we're looking at, they're looking at various regulatory barriers and saying the administration has an opportunity to potentially get some of them removed or at least lightened. So with that overview, Rich, share with us some of the positive impacts these will have down kind of on the ground with the public housing authorities themselves.
Sure. Mike, I couldn't agree more. I think deregulation, just a huge benefit to PHAs. If you talk to any executive director across the country, the cost of program compliance is a huge burden. PH within both the Section 8 program and the Section 9 programs. And any relief there, I think, would go right to their bottom line in the form of reduced staffing costs. Authorities need real specialized staff applying with these program regulations, specialized consultants. So if they're relieved of that burden, it will go directly to the bottom line. So that was great to hear from Peter about deregulation. I'm sure that will be well received. Also, deregulation, if you can provide PHAs flexibility to move funds between HUD programs and HUD projects, that would also provide a welcome benefit. Quite often you'll see a PHA may operate a Section 8 program with healthy reserves. And then that same PHA may operate a public housing property and a deficit. Current regulations permit fungibility of those Section 8 funds so that public housing property suffers while the Section 8 program thrives. As Peter mentioned, I think HUD could accomplish, this fungibility through the Moving to Work program, which provides in its enabling legislation the flexibility to leverage certain HUD funds across various programs. Right now, that MTW program, which is the acronym for Moving to Work, currently only includes about 138 of a possible 3,300 PHAs. And MTW was designed to test new and innovative ways to address local housing needs through the waiving of certain HUD regulations. And so this program really fits with FEMA deregulation.
Yeah, that statistic, 138 of a possible approximately 3,300 PHAs. I knew it wasn't widely adopted. I don't know that I had appreciated how super narrowly it's applied. So now those are wonderful opportunities. Now let's go to the more challenging question, a question that we don't know a lot about other than sort of directionally. We all acknowledge that there'll be greater challenges with respect to HUD funding. Particularly, there's a challenge of HUD funding in any environment with large deficits and the rest. But given all the discussion of cutting spending, and this isn't just slowing the rate of increase, talking about actually reducing sort of the baseline. When we think about HUD, there's a lot of concerns, obviously, among housing authorities and beyond, but focusing a bit on housing authorities, it's one thing to say it on a campaign trail. It's obviously quite another thing to have it enacted by Congress and signed by the president. So with that as maybe a slow, soft introduction to this question, Peter, when you think of the potential budget cuts and some of the concerns out there, how do you discuss that with potential with PHAs or other potential users of HUD programs in terms of the likelihood of such large cuts being implemented?
So it is a real threat. I think many in the affordable housing policy community are expecting, cuts to HUD programs of various types. Yeah, and I think one of the key triggers for this is that Congress is going to need to address the nation's debt limit. Actually, today is the day that Treasury triggers extraordinary measures to help avoid a breach in the debt limit after the suspension expired at the beginning of the year. And we expect that these measures will allow Treasury to operate up until certainly, we believe, March 15th, when the quarterly corporate tax payments are expected to help prolong things. And then, of course, on April 15th, you've got the individual tax filing that also will help prolong the ability of Treasury to use these measures. But at some time in, say, June and July, which is actually also during the time when Congress typically starts writing the various annual spending bills, they're going to have to address that debt limit. And, when the last time they did that, they instituted pretty strict spending caps on discretionary spending, especially, non-defense discretionary spending. And so I wouldn't be surprised if that happens again when they address the debt limit again this year. And there's, two ways they're going to do that. Either they're going to do it on a partisan basis where there's a specific, dollar amount increase on the debt limit. And I think the Faustian bargain to get that will mean some sort of equal amount or of budget cuts, or they're going to have to suspend the debt limit again. And while that will probably require some buy-in from Democrats, again, I wouldn't be surprised if there's some sort of spending cap component of a debt limit increase. So that's one way to do it. The other way that we think budget cuts might effectuate is we know that the Trump administration, and we're hearing that, as is the case most times, the first year of administration, their budget request is likely going to be delayed. So instead of being the historical norm of the first Monday in February, we're now hearing it's probably more likely to be May, which is understandable given that they don't even haven't finished fiscal year 2025 yet. And regardless, whatever first budget request does come out, I wouldn't be surprised to see very drastic proposed cuts. It's always an aspirational document. This is what, if it was completely up to the Trump administration without Congress, this is what they would be asking for. And we don't think all of those will get effectuated, but it'll certainly influence the debate. And, Congress is only going to restore funding to some extent. And what I think is the classic dynamics you see in the HUD budget process is because the rental assistance programs generally need an increase to deal with higher rents that you see from year to year. That typically means that the rest of the HUD budget gets hit in that dynamic. And, so HUD budget programs that sort of focus on future housing instead of an existing family, where if you cut a voucher, you may actually force that family into homelessness. Congress never wants to be accused of that. It's much easier to cut things like home and CDBG and the Public Housing Capital Fund for choice neighborhoods, given that that sort of focus on future housing and doesn't directly impact the housing for an existing family. I think that's something we're very much expecting in the HUD budget process. And that, I think, is something that you've got to take seriously as the debate goes forward.
So, Peter, when I think of the HUD budget and I think of where the exposure is to cuts, I certainly agree with you conceptually with respect to what gets cut last and the rest. And would like to get your thoughts on my sort of framing, because I end up looking at this and thinking that, when I think of the HUD budget, I will start with at the center project-based Section 8. And that's a situation where there's rent vouchers going to a project to allow the residents to live in that unit. And those project-based vouchers go up, the payments have to go up every year to cover higher operating expenses. And that's one that if you cut that, you'd have tenants on the street, a couple hundred or whatever, how many in a building suddenly not having a subsidy. So it seems like, as you were sort of saying, tenant-based or project-based is like number one. And then secondly, you then say, okay, you got to fund that at some level of increase. And then you have tenant-based, and those are housing choice vouchers that are with individual sort of tenants. And you say, okay, maybe I won't add more, but anyone who has one, the cost of housing is going up every year. So there, you don't, as a general matter, want to be taking away the voucher they already have. So then that becomes like, there's some minimum number there. You can say no new vouchers and all the rest, but you're not taking something away. And then you have operating expenses for public housing authorities. And you go, that's something that they have to be funded at a level to operate. So then that becomes that, if I'm thinking of nesting dolls in reverse order, you then have that. And then you get to the slightly more discretionary. It's not really discretionary, but then you get to the public housing capital fund, which, it ends up oftentimes seeing cuts because that's their real capital needs, not nearly the backlog of capital needs. We all know how great it is, but that ends up getting oftentimes a little bit of a cut. And then, as you mentioned, all these other programs that are all about new housing or renovating housing that's not already within HUD, that ends up being from the standpoint of the political constituency, the ones with least adverse effects. Any comments on that?
Yeah, no, exactly. That's the framing I think is spot on. And, I think for those who care very deeply about home and CDBG, it's going to be crucial to be, very active in advocacy, because without that, they are, very likely they're the most vulnerable to cuts. And that's not to mean that you can sit back and not do anything if you're an owner of a project-based Section 8 property, or if you're a PHA with voucher out there. It's certainly, the advocacy is needed there, but I know that the vulnerabilities that you see year in, year out, those home CDBG choice, those tend to be the more vulnerable programs.
And there's definitely other ways, and I also didn't mean to simplify those others as much as I did, because how those calculations are done obviously has a huge impact on what the cost is. So there's a lot of changes that can happen with project-based section, project-based vouchers, as well as tenant-based vouchers in terms of minimum rent payments by residents and things of that nature that can affect the cost and the level of increases and the rest. Let's turn to you, Rich. With that as background, when I'm a public housing authority, I'm probably concerned about what my operating expense coverage will be, as well as concerned about the capital fund to deal with my deferred capital costs. Please expand on that and share what, as a public housing authority, you're hearing that there are the concerns, or if you're not hearing it, things they should be thinking.
So I agree with everything you and Peter just talked about. I think PHAs and the respective trade associations are going to have a little bit of a battle on their hands to maintain funding levels because they are expecting less than being fully funded. I think for the Section 9 programs, right now they've seen a budget from proposals
Let me interrupt you.
of modest.
Let me interrupt you for our audience that
Sure.
are familiar with these code sections. Explain what you say section.
Sure. So section 9 is really the public housing operating fund and public housing capital fund. Public housing program is considered Section 9 of the United States Housing Act. That's the enabling legislation. So the Senate proposed a modest decrease there of about 2%. Public housing operating fund, which is operating expense, cover operating expenses. And then they did propose the same funding level for capital fund, which is future repairs to the capital repairs to public housing. House, on the other hand, proposed a 7.5% decrease operating fund funding, 5% decrease in the capital fund. Now, when you're factoring in the PHAs have incredible increases in insurance costs over the last couple of years, there's been inflation. Right now, I've seen, I think since COVID, this has been the highest tenant AR that we've seen. So housing authorities are collecting a lot of cash from tenant. Increased compliance requirements for unit inspections. The new Inspire program provides for national standards for physical inspections. That costs money. So these things all really are going to have a negative impact on PHA program finances. Even if they were funded at 100%, I think it would, you're bringing it into a deficit situation with these increased costs. As far as Section 8 goes, I think the Senate proposed a 12.4% increase in voucher renewals and a 4% increase in admin fees. House has proposed flat funding for voucher contracts, which is rent and admin fees. Now, you might think that's not so bad, but you touched on it before, that per unit costs are increasing at nearly 10% year over year. I think PHAs are kind of preparing for that.
Mike, if I could just jump in here just quickly, I want to just point out that when Rich is talking about the Senate, he's talking about the previous Senate that was controlled by Democrats. People are wondering because we definitely think now Senate's being controlled by Republicans. We'll see a change in how they approach a lot of the appropriations funding too. And while I don't expect them to be as strict cuts as the House tends to be, they're certainly not going to be as positive as the Democratic Senate has historically been for HUD funding.
Thank you, Peter, for that, because they've only been in office, this new Senate, for a couple of weeks, and they have not put forth any proposal.
I got to make the same observation, Peter. The House might be a little bit more aggressive, the current House, and as you note, the Senate will be closer to the House now that it's controlled by Republicans, and before it was controlled by the Democratic Party. So now that's, concerning, to say the least, if I'm a public housing authority looking at how I'm going to fund my agency and the housing needs of those that I serve. What advice are you giving PHAs as to ways to mitigate the effect of, I'm not going to call them looming cuts. I want to call them potential cuts.
Potential. Yes, I agree. I think to really properly answer that question, you need to almost separate PHAs into two buckets. First there's the PHAs that are totally in line, totally HUD subsidies. They really have no other non-federal program. Maybe it's just a voucher program, a capital program in public housing. And then there's the PHAs that have diversified their housing portfolio over the last several years, and they're lesser reliance on HUD. Um, so bucket one, let's just jump into that first. That's mostly the smaller PHAs under 250 public housing units. We've really been talking to those PHAs about the Section 22 streamlined voluntary conversion. You've got something that could get approval relatively fast, in 90 days, and that conversion can happen within a year. And so what happens with Section 22 is a PHA with a small PHA, say they have public housing capital fund and a voucher, and they're operating 3 programs, responsible for compliance, 3 programs, and they have to have all these professionals on staff to maintain compliance. Well, with Section 22, you can convert that public housing program in the capital fund into the voucher program. And so you can eliminate the need for compliance over the other programs. And so now you're streamlined into one Section 8 program. And as we know, Section 8 has been much more reliable than the traditional Section 9 programs in the past as far as for funding, and you get your regular OCAF adjustments. So that's one thing we're talking to housing authorities about. Also, these smaller housing authorities, unfortunately, they're going to have to contract out certain management and program administrative functions to maybe another PHA through shared service agreements. Most PHAs, they're separate governments, they're separate entities. They need an executive director, CFO. If they're operating Section 8, they have to have a Section 8 program manager, a public housing manager, inspectors, maintenance staff. So contracting these services out will save on salaries, employee benefits, and it gives the housing authority just a smaller footprint. And that is something that has worked very well in the past for PHAs. Contracted with the larger neighboring PHA has capacity, can help provide vital services. And then finally, unfortunately, employee benefit packages seem one of also the larger expenses on a PHA profit loss statement. A lot of PHAs offer these long-term employment lifetime post-employment benefit packages. They're very popular, but they're very, very cost prohibitive. We see the actuarial calculations come out every year when we incorporate them into our annual audits. So a lot of PHAs are talking about, hey, for new employees, for non-vested employees, look to put them into a more of a defined benefit program, something that doesn't provide lifetime benefits. For jumping back to bucket 2, now these are traditionally your larger PHAs that have more of a diversified housing portfolio. This typical PHA may currently be administering programs in conjunction with their state and local government. They may have utilized the RAD program to create tax credit properties. They may have been developing and managing affordable housing units through nonprofits. Basically, what we've been consulting on for the last 10 to 15 years to do. So basically, they have more sources of non-federal revenue, have a more sophisticated professional staff, and that provides for opportunities in times of change. Fortunately for them, unfortunately for other housing authorities. So they're in a good spot to earn additional revenues by providing management and program services to the smaller PHAs that we talked about in bucket 1 that don't have this expertise and really didn't change over the years and adapt over the years. Also, these housing authorities, the more diversified staff and housing portfolio, are in a much better position to take back these previously mixed finance tax credit projects that are sitting out there from the early 2000s, the old Hope programs. Housing authorities are sitting with some options to take back these properties. And they really have an opportunity to expand their property management capability, earn additional fees there, maybe future syndication and development. So that's something else. And finally, these housing authorities as I mentioned, do have a specialized staff. So they are positioned to offer services to the local, state, and local government, property management services. Many county governments run a voucher program, and they could administer that program for your county government, developer service and management to these governments. So the bucket two housing authorities that have diversified their portfolio since RAD 10, 12 years ago are really in much better shape to weather a potential storm or
Yeah, that sort of just demonstrates the power of diversification and the
yeah, yeah.
power of a growth mindset in terms of trying to provide housing needs in a variety of ways and not solely reliant on HUD funding.
Yeah.
So I don't want to say this aloud such that it occurs. And I'm reluctant to put this out in the universe, but it's already out there. And that just has to do with, let's go down a sort of darker scenario where there are notable cuts to HUD funding for public housing authorities. And let me also posit that I'm a housing authority that doesn't have an ability to offset that cut through just efficiencies, or I don't have other areas where I have revenues that can cover that shortfall. What will happen? What does your experience tell you?
Unfortunately, and I've been auditing housing authorities since they converted to generally accepted accounting principles in the year 2000, is unfortunately, I think public housing units will suffer. If housing authorities can't cope with the cutbacks and can't generate additional revenues, you just see more of a deterioration as maintenance gets deferred. That essential maintenance that you need, paint the carpets, the plumbing, that's all going to get deferred because going to be the funds there to pay for it. And it's unfortunate, but that's I've seen that happen, and that is probably on the table. It's trying to sound doom and gloom.
No, it's just simple math.
Yeah.
In the sense that, the costs that have to get paid will get paid first, and the costs that you would like to pay and the expenses you'd like to incur to maintain the quality of the units, but or about utilities and basically keeping the lights on, those end up getting deferred, unfortunately.
Right. That's right.
And unfortunately, it's an adequate adjective to describe. It's more disastrous. So let's now turn to the advice you're giving clients on a more sort of positive note. Based on what we've discussed so far, what are you telling your clients right now that are coming to you with all this uncertainty, but directionally, they're not looking at it thinking this growth and expansion time. It's more of a, how do I address the potential challenges? Tell me your advice. If I'm a PHA, what would you be telling me?
One of the things that governments in general, they seem to be very reactive instead of proactive in nature. And, we've been given PHAs consistent advice for the last 10 to 15 years. And I touched on that. We've talked about what you can do now. We talked about, bucket one and bucket two, what housing authority can do now to cut costs and generate additional revenue. But in general, big picture, they have to look to the future and diversifying their housing portfolio, less dependent on Section 9 public housing subsidies, as well as, like I said, the one-time CDBG funds and the home grants and the choice neighborhood grants. They really need to move away from reliance on that as much as possible. And diversification can happen through the RAD program. I think the RAD program has really delivered for a lot of PHAs in that area. A lot of our clients have done tremendous work with the RAD program. I think to date, you've had over 180,000 units have been rehab public housing units. Another 60,000 are actively converting. You've got 140,000 that are reserved with their CHAP. But there's still 75,000 units available under the cap. Now, Peter touched on maybe that cap will go away, but there are still 75,000 units available. So there's still opportunity for housing authorities to take advantage of the RAD program. I should add that over 22 billion hasn't been invested in public housing, on closed transactions. Now, in the RAD program, I think it was about 2012 where it came out. So it's been around 13, 14 years. But it is, I have to say, HUD has done a really a nice job of giving PHAs opportunities to increase rent, to be flexible. They've been very flexible with regulations. They've modified the regulations. They've let housing authorities find ways, creative ways to increase RAD rents. But, with that said, Mike, you're very familiar with the environment now. It has not been great over the last couple of years for the extensive rehabilitation of units, which has caused a lot of PHAs to pause with their RAD conversions. We've had higher interest rates, high insurance costs, and really just general inflation has really hindered these RAD deals from penciling out. And I think the ones that have made the deals pencil out have been the ones that have had their own funds to increase the equity contribution to the project, the RAD project, or have done so utilizing other state and local government reserves. And they've been able to use reserves from their local government and to make some of these deals work. And so that's where we're really pushing housing authorities, because these things happen, whether there's going to be cutbacks this year or again in 5 years or again, eventually this is a goal. And you really want to get out of this trap of cutbacks and struggling and trying to make ends meet.
Yeah, I'll just jump in, Mike, and say, I think, one needs to think outside the usual box when these types of scenarios and try to find, there are also state and local programs sometimes that PHAs don't always are aware of to help address, mixed finance ways of preserving their properties in their portfolio. We would encourage folks to investigate those options. The larger PHAs tend to be more comfortable, at going out there, but there's been successful middle-sized and even small-sized PHAs out there that have been innovative. And I think there's going to be a need to do that in a challenging funding environment that we expect to experience in these next 4 years. So that's what I would encourage PHAs to do. And we here at Novogradac have lots of resources and ideas to help them navigate their way.
Yeah, I think all that advice is super appropriate, particularly now, but it's really even, with the prior administration, it wasn't like it was a golden age of housing authority funding and the rest. So it's something that, irrespective of the administrations, it's good advice. It can be more pressing in different circumstances. The other thing I would add is there is a role for advocacy, and there are a number of public housing authority organizations, or I shouldn't say councils, or trade associations that are there making the case to senators and to representatives. So it is something that, in addition to responding appropriately on what actually happens, there's also an opportunity to influence what happens. And, I think we all would encourage public housing authorities to make themselves heard. Not that kind of have it in the past, but it's not so much what you did in the past, it's what you're going to do going forward. With that, before we do wrap up, I do want to give each of you a chance to share anything else you would like our audience to know. And I'll start with you, Peter, and then I'll go to Rich.
I want to reiterate again, Mike, that we're more than happy if you see there's a barrier in HUD regulations or guidance that you want to help work on, and we're more than willing to help work with you in engagement to address them. Some of these issues may be also pressed by the trade association, but we know that sometimes there are particular challenges that PHAs have. I'm more and more happy to engage you on that. I do also want to note our next affordable housing conference is coming up May 8th through 9th in San Francisco. It's one of the larger of our affordable housing conferences, and we hope to see you there. A lot of fellow PHAs are going to be attending that conference, and you can help exchange ideas. We'll probably have the budget out by that time, so we'll be able to sort of take a closer look about what the possibilities are. And so I look forward to seeing some of you at that conference.
Rich.
Okay, Mike, I think I'm going to lead with maybe one of my favorite quotes, because I think it may be appropriate here. And that is, if you do not change direction, you may end up where you're headed. And I think in the next couple of years, inevitable costs will be higher. Funding may be lower, but there will be opportunities to change the directory of your PHA. And I encourage PHAs to embrace these opportunities. Change can be good. And, if you have any questions, please do not hesitate to contact us at Novogradac. I would be happy to talk to you about everything we talked about here today.
Thank you, Reg. Thank you, Peter. Before we get to the off mic section, I do want to remind the audience to please subscribe to the podcast on whatever platform you prefer. Also, please do share the podcast with your colleagues who may be interested, or at least should be interested, and you can encourage them to listen. Also, as a reminder, we do have the full archive of episodes available on our website at novoco.com. Now let's turn to our off mic section. And we like to use this space to give a shout out to someone working in one of the many community development areas that we work. It's an opportunity to highlight a professional who my guest believes deserves recognition. So Rich, I'll let you go first. Who would you like to give a shout out to?
I'd love to give a shout out to the new executive team at the Cook County Housing Authority in Chicago. Danita Childers, executive director, and the comptroller, Kathleen Great-Volta. They're both relatively new to the housing authority, and they're doing a great job. And we love working with them, and it's been a fantastic experience. So shout out to Danita and Kathleen.
Peter, how about you?
Well, both Rich and I have been invited to work on what's called the 10-year roadmap, which is I think a convening of various public housing stakeholder groups to help try to find a more long-term successful way to run public housing authorities and establish more stable forms of financing. And so I want to give a shout out to one of the conveners and organizers of that 10-year roadmap effort. That's Sunia Zaderman, the executive director of the Council of Large Public Housing Authorities. Sunia has been a long-standing partner of ours and, been one of the leaders in trying to find a way to improve the situation for not just her membership, I think, but for the broader PHA community as well. So we very much appreciate being invited to participate in that effort. Look forward to working with her and others to provide a more stable, financing future for PHAs.
Excellent. I echo those shout outs. And let me say again, thank you, Peter Lawrence, Novogradac's head of public policy, and Rich Larsen, one of the Novogradac experts on public housing authorities and all things HUD. Thank you for joining on the podcast today. And to our audience, I'm Michael Novogradac. Thanks for listening.
This weekly podcast has been brought to you by Novogradac & Company, LLP. Archived podcasts are available online at www.novoco.com/podcast or by subscribing to the Tax Credit Tuesday podcast in iTunes, Spotify, YouTube, Google Podcasts, Stitcher, and Radio Public. You can find related links referenced in this podcast on our website at www.novoco.com/podcast. Novogradac & Company, LLP is a national certified public accounting and consulting firm with offices nationwide. Learn more about our professional services at www.novoco.com.